All right. Good morning, everybody. Hi. Thank you so much for coming today. Happy Friday. My name is Liana. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm the peer advisor of the Women's Collective. I have the council here with me and obviously Dr. Janet Muñiz, who will be speaking on her experiences. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ana Yeli, who will help us get started. There will be some folks joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ana Yeli. I'm on the Women's Collective Council. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and for our speaker, Dr. Muñiz, for joining us today. I just wanted to go over some guidelines. So this presentation will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, CSULB WGC, in case anyone wants to check it out afterwards. And participants are encouraged to keep their cameras on. Mics will be muted until the Q&A session, but feel free to type in the chat or just wait until the Q&A session to ask any questions. So yeah, our Q&A session will be at the end. You can type your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. That way you don't forget them if you want. And we do encourage you to use your response and those little emojis on Zoom just to help with the encouragement during the presentation. So yeah, thank you so much for being here again.
All right, I'll go ahead and get us started by reading the acknowledgement, and we'll go ahead and start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work at the sacred site of Womxn. We pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives, relations past, present, and emerging. And then we'll also read the labor acknowledgement. We recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which our country, state, and institution are built. We remember that our country was built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from the African continent, and recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge all immigrant and indigenous labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who contributed to the building of the country and continue to serve within our labor force. We recognize that our country is continuously defined, supported, and built upon by oppressed communities and peoples. We acknowledge labor inequities and the shared responsibility for combating oppressive systems in our daily work.
The mission of the Women's and Gender Equity Center is to inform and prepare the campus and larger community to foster an understanding of gender that is continually evolving in academia and society. Our responsibility is to promote gender equity affairs amongst individuals of diverse gender and intersecting identities through gender equity advocacy. The mission of the Women's Collective is to build an empowering community amongst women students of color on campus by enriching their educational and social experience and also personal needs through programming, resources, and engaging in a supportive network.
And so with that mission, I would like to introduce our council. Our first member is NALE, that first started our introduction, and then we had Mina that just read our mission, and then I'm Diana, and then we also have Lindsay and Roxana.
Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a sociology major. I'm the SSA president, and the Sociology Student Association is a place where one can expand their knowledge, network, meet new people, and give back to the community. SSA will have workshops that help students gain information on educational career opportunities, community outreach events, and social events. And SSA gives you the opportunity to enhance your experience in an educational and fun way. And you don't have to be a sociology major to join. Joining me, I have my treasurer, Christine, and my online coordinator, Ariana Ortega, if they want to introduce themselves.
All right, please give a warm welcome to our amazing panelists, Dr. Janet Muñiz. Dr. Janet Muñiz is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at California State University, the University of Long Beach. She is a first-generation non-traditional student from a working class Mexican immigrant background. She obtained a BA in Feminist Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she was involved in Chicana feminist organizations doing outreach and mentoring local youth. She has also received an MA in Cultural Studies from Claremont Graduate University and completed her Ph.D. in Sociology in 2021 from the University of California Irvine. Before working at CSULB, Dr. Muñiz taught at Cal Poly Pomona, Pitzer College, and to incarcerated students enrolled remotely through Lake Tahoe Community College. She teaches and does research around Latinx communities, ethnic identities, and entrepreneurship. Her current research project looks at gentrification of her hometown in downtown Santa Ana.
Is that my cue now? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Okay, my name is Janet Muñiz, Dr. Muñiz. It still feels kind of weird to say that, I guess. Okay, so I saw that a lot of you all, well, first of all, thank you to the event folks for having me here, and to Anayeli, who's my student, for reaching out about this opportunity. I did have a presentation I want to show you. It's all photos because I like to tell stories, but I don't want to just look at myself. So I'm gonna share my slides with you. Okay, so the way I'm gonna do this is I'm gonna sort of tell you about my trajectory, and then I wanna not talk so much about myself and then leave it open to questions, because I know there was a lot of really good questions that I saw that were submitted, and I'd rather talk about that than just talk about myself. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I am from the local area of Santa Ana. So I was born and raised in Orange County. My family has been there for 50 some years. My grandpa came from Mexico as part of the Bracero program, which is a program that contracted migrant laborers to Orange County, and came to Orange County with my dad when he was little. So both of my parents are immigrants, although they came when they were like 4 or 5 years old. So that makes, I teach immigration, so that makes like their experience as immigrant parents a lot different than like if your parents were to maybe come when they were like adults, for example, right? And so I was born and raised in Orange County. I'm a non-traditional student, as I guess sometimes is called, in that I went to community college first. I did what I think a lot of people don't do, is I moved away to go to community college. So I moved to Santa Barbara, and I went to community college there because I really wanted to go to UC Santa Barbara, because at the time I was sort of following somebody that I was dating, which I would suggest to not do. But I mean, hey, it landed me a PhD. So that like I went to Santa Barbara, and I was like set on like going to the same university of UCSB. I went to community college for 2 years while I was there. And I was like super concerned with transferring, quote unquote, on time, right? I was like, I moved here, I moved away, I need to do this in 2 years and not get stuck in community college, because I needed to like prove to everybody that it was worth it, that I like moved away from home kind of, to go to community college. And then I transferred to UC Santa Barbara. At the time, I wanted to be a political science major because I wanted to be a lawyer. So I was I didn't become a sociologist actually until grad school. So I took poli-sci classes. My political science professor in community college was amazing. It was great. But then when I transferred to Santa Barbara, to be honest, the political science classes were really boring for me. It was like political theory. And I was like, why are we learning? Like, what does theory have to do with the law? Like, what does this have to do with like helping people as a lawyer? And I started taking additional classes for like requirements, like electives essentially. And so I started taking Chicano studies classes, as well as at UCSB, it was called Feminist Studies at the time, so not gender studies or women's studies. It was feminist studies. And so I decided to take those classes, and I thought they were super interesting. And my mind was sort of like mind blown or like expanded by the fact that like I was learning things at that point that like I hadn't learned ever before, in terms of like maybe history of like Mexican American people, or like inequality, or about oppression, things that in political science they didn't really talk about so much, I guess. And so I decided to go full force into that, and I changed my major. So my official like bachelor's degree is in feminist studies. I changed my major and I became super, super involved like in everything. And so that's what my next slide is here. So my next slide is like kind of like everything I was involved in when I was in college. I was super involved in this group called Mujer, which in Spanish is an acronym that's Mujeres Unidas por Justicia, Educación y Revolución. So Women United for Justice, Education, and Revolution. And so we like were very, it was a subset of, if anyone knows of Mecha, which is kind of the like a Chicano organization. It was like the women's subgroup. Mecha originated in Santa Barbara, and so it had a really big presence on our campus. And it had a bunch of subgroups. Like there was subgroups for people who were in like STEM fields, subgroups for people who wanted to be teachers, subgroups for like men, subgroups for queer people, subgroups for women. And so I became super involved in this group. These are the images that are on the left. And so our like involvement was we had this like annual conference that we did every year, called Mujercitas, or like young women, like, and so we like partnered with the local high schools in the Santa Barbara area, and we would throw a conference for them every year. And it was like an ongoing tradition that happened for, I think when I was there, one year it was like the 15th year. So we did it like quinceañera themed, like a 15th birthday party. And this was all completely run by us, like coordinating the buses, going to the high schools, getting the girls to apply. Like, this image with the two girls in the front are two scholarship recipients. We would fundraise for scholarships. We were literally like doing all this work that now I'm like, where was the institution in any of this, right? Like, where was the university? It was all like student led, where we like fundraise, like I think it was like $1,000 for these girls to like use for college. And we like created the application, like read the application, selected the people who got the money. We were super involved, and these like women in these organizations ended up being, I mean, they're still my friends now. And I graduated from college in like 2011. So what is that, like 11 years ago now? And so, yeah, like people in this group I've stayed in touch with who like went to grad school, who became social workers, who like are professors now, and became like super instrumental in my time, like surviving college also, because I think what's unique about Cal State Long Beach that maybe is an experience I didn't have is that UC Santa Barbara was a predominantly white institution when I was there. I think Latinos were maybe 12% of the population. And so we obviously faced like a lot of hostility, race, like blatant racism. And so it was super important for us to like stay together. And so we also did a lot of protesting and organizing. So this image that's up here with women who are in our organization is from the LA Times. There was a really big protest that happened in 2009 at UCLA for tuition increases in the entire UC system. And so I remember this was like one of my first protests I went to, where we were this pretty like radical, I guess if you want to call it that, organization of like blocking streets, like protesting kind of thing. Like people I was in organizations with were very much like, I don't care if I like get arrested for like protesting or something like that. And so all of this was sort of like shaping my political consciousness at the time, that I think has sort of like informed how I continue to like navigate through the world now as like a professional or professor. This image on the bottom I included it because I think this is the equivalent of like what the women and gender equity maybe people do here on campus. We had a multicultural center on campus, and it had we had like AS associated students, and they had like it was called a women's commission, which sounds kind of similar to what the organization here does. And we did this thing where we decided to I think we had to raise like $20,000 from different organizations on campus to reinstate this like UC-wide Women of Color conference. So I think it had been gone for many years, and we decided to like bring it back. And I don't know if you all know Janelle Monáe. Now she's like super popular, like a musician. Remember, we brought like Janelle Monáe to like perform. We brought like people from UC, like all the UC campuses. And so we like had like a day full of workshops, right? And so I became like super invested in all of these things. So my college times were very, obviously, a lot of what I did outside of class, right? All of this was everything I did outside of going to school. While I also like worked in admissions, right? As like my job, and like I was super involved in activist organizing essentially. And it became like a really big part of my identity. And a big part of like why I continued to like do my major or wanted to go to grad school. So I think my next slide is about going to grad school. So essentially during this time, I had moved away from home. So my home of Santa Ana, I graduated high school 2007. I moved away. While I was away, the downtown of my city was undergoing a bunch of changes. What is then known as like gentrification. So this is like photos that I can best describe like kind of what happened in my downtown while I was gone, where people started to vitalize downtown. And the downtown area was going from this like predominantly immigrant Mexican neighborhood that would sell maybe things that like immigrant Latinos would need, right? Like things in Spanish, sending money home, to these like new kind of like Mexican American things. And I was like really interested in what that meant and what it looked like, and who was like participating in it. I was like, who's gentrifying? Is it white folks? Like white folks don't want to live in Santa Ana. And so I was like, these questions like I wanted to further understand. But when I was an undergrad, since I had transferred, I didn't really have any info about going to grad school, because I think when I got to Santa Barbara, I was like, okay, I transferred in 2 years. Now I'm here for 2 years. I need to figure out how to finish and get my like BA, right? Like I'm not thinking about grad school. At the Cal States, we don't have PhD programs, but if you go to a UC school like I did, you would have more interaction with PhD students in your classes as like teaching assistants. So in my classes, like my Chicano studies and feminist studies classes, I had TAs who were PhD students, and I was like confused. I was like, well, they're not my professor and they're not undergrads like me, and they don't teach the class, but they're like there and they grade. And so I started talking to them like, what do you do? Like, who are you? What is a PhD? And they sort of like started to mentor me. And one of them sort of recruited me to help her with her dissertation research. Now she's a professor at Fullerton College but at the time she was a grad student in Chicano studies. And she was like doing research on Chicana feminist organizers in LA. And she kind of just like took me along with her. And I think, again, my mind was like expanded that like research could be observing people and talking to people in the social world that wasn't like in a lab, like what I think of like people in bio doing or something like that. And I was like, oh, I can like go to grad school and get a PhD, like understanding what people do. And they were like, yeah. And they helped me apply to grad programs. And at that time, I had like no research experience, which is kind of hard to apply to a PhD program with little to no research experience. So I went to a master's program at the Claremont colleges for like 2 years. And in between then, I went to this like summer research program at UCI to do research for my master's thesis. And then I applied to PhD programs and I got into UCI, where I did my PhD. And so at the time, if you don't know, a PhD program takes a really long time. My PhD was 7 years. So at that time, you have like a lot of time to do a lot of different things. So in the time of my PhD, I have some of these photos to show like the importance of like cohorts. Because when you do a PhD, if you don't know, you take classes for like 2 to 3 years. And then you kind of propose what you're going to do as a research project in the next couple of years, and you like prove that you can do it. And then you go do it and you like collect the data or read the readings and write it up and analyze it. And then you like defend it, which is essentially like you write a really huge thesis. That's like the very simplified version of it. So 7 years is kind of a long time to do a lot of other things at the same time. So during that time that I was a graduate student at UC, I taught my first class. That's the photo on the bottom. I taught qualitative research methods at Cal Poly Pomona. I also taught at Pitzer College, qualitative methods as well. Pitzer College is a liberal arts school. That's part of the Claremont colleges, which is where I did my master's. I did this like research program also as a grad student, another one that was like to prepare people of color to get faculty jobs, like as professors. I have this other image here because I also worked on a research project aside from my own research where I interviewed incarcerated people and their family members to understand the impacts of their like livelihoods while incarcerated. And that also led me to then teach incarcerated students. Like was mentioned in my intro, I like taught introduction to sociology to students who were enrolled through Lake Tahoe Community College, who were incarcerated in Northern California. Everything was done by the mail. So that was like super interesting, where like I would send them packets of like intro to sociology, like textbook, and then like essay questions, and they had to respond like written in essay. And then they send it back to me, and then I grade them, and then I send it back to them. So it was like a super big lag time, but that's really the only way to teach something like that. And right, they were learning like the same intro to Soc book that I've taught at UCI. That's like the same one everybody uses, right? And yeah, that's just sort of like the span of my teaching coming to Cal State Long Beach. And so these are like photos that show sort of like the end of my trajectory while I was at UCI. Because like I said, the program was 7 years long. I finished my PhD a month before I started this job. So I finished my PhD last July. And then I started the job in August. So I remember like in that month, I like had to move from Irvine and find a place to live in Long Beach. I had to like come up with the classes I was going to teach. I had to like figure out like, where's my office? How do I assign a book to a class? How do I create a beach board? But then also I was like, I need to chill before I start a job as a professor. This photo here is with my mom in front of the UCI thing on my graduation. This is like some graduation photo I took. This is like where my office was as a grad student in Social Science Tower at UCI. The photo here are people who are in my cohort in graduate school. So when you're in grad school, you start with like a cohort of people. My cohort was pretty big. There was like 20 of us who started. And yeah, this was my office mate, Ted, who now work, we all finished our PhD. He was really instrumental in just social support during grad school. Since we shared an office together as graduate students. Now he works for a dual immersion program in school, because his dissertation was about dual immersion programs. This is my friend Chris, who was also in my cohort, who's now professor at Cal State Fullerton in sociology. And this is my friend Oshin, who also finished his PhD with me, who now is a researcher for like a private research organization in LA. And so these are kind of like the spans of different things that people also did with their PhD. And so I wanted to share some photos of stuff from like now, me being at Long Beach. So this is me with my little like beach mentor thing to show. These are my two students who are on here, Isabel and Ada. So I am a professor in the sociology department. The classes I teach are in migration and Latino communities. When you do a PhD, you do a very, very specific specialized topic, and you also get a job in a very specialized topic. So Cal State Long Beach was like, we need somebody who knows about Latinx communities. And so only people apply to that job who have PhDs who can teach and research Latinx communities. And so that was very fitting with like the work I did on Santa Ana and the work I did with people who were incarcerated, and the teaching that I had done through all these different institutions. This is me with my students. Ada is a McNair scholar. Isabel is a Build scholar. These are different research programs on campus. And this is us at the annual meeting this summer of the American Sociological Association. So I find it like super important myself to like mentor students or like pass down information as part of my job, only because like I have only learned how to navigate all of this through other people who pass down this info, right? Like my parents don't have PhDs, like my parents didn't graduate high school, like my mom she's actually getting her GED right now. And so like she didn't graduate from high school, but she's doing it now as like in her late 50s, right? And so yeah, all of this information I've learned from other, mostly women of color actually, who sort of like have guided me through the pathway. So I've found it like super important in my like way I operate to like also share information that I know with people like who are also looking for the same pathway. And so that I am able to like, right, this is, I mentioned that like, I also do this work on Santa Ana, which is where I'm from. So if you don't know, I'm a professor who's on the tenure track, which means professors you may have heard of like who are tenured or on the tenure track. Tenure essentially means you have like job security. So while you're on the tenure track is essentially that you are on like a probationary time until you get tenure. And so you get evaluated in different categories of your job to get tenure. And that happens in year 6 of your job. So you have to do, so my job isn't just like coming here and teaching like 3 classes a semester. I have to teach, I have to do research, and I have to do service, right? So I advise the Sociology Student Association, SSA, the Honor Society that we have a chapter of here. I'm on like the grade appeals committee, right? There's all these like internal things, right? I do service through my mentoring of students in the different research programs. I also have to maintain like an active research agenda. So I have to like publish, I have to work on a project, like Isabel and I are working on a project related to health as it relates to the branding of Santa Ana through this like wellness proposal that happened while I was doing my research. I'm also co-authoring this paper with a professor at UC Irvine from the time that I worked on the jail study about how men navigate the labor market while they are incarcerated and released. And so I think sometimes that's like a lot of unseen labor that professors do that maybe students are like, what do my professors do all day? They just have to show up and teach. And so, yeah, the jobs have like all of these internal like structures to them, right? And so, yeah, I just wanted to like then go to address some of the questions in terms of like, right, like, I don't know if folks know about, like, I'm not here to be like, everybody should get a PhD, like getting a PhD is so great, or like this like ticket to like, I don't know, being a professor, or, you know, all of these things, but it's to say that like, I didn't start my educational trajectory thinking that like, oh, I'm going to get a PhD, right? It kind of like happened throughout the way as I continued to like expand what I knew, right? Because I didn't know anybody with a PhD, like I didn't know anyone who had a BA. And so as I kept going, I kept like seeking out people who had what I wanted or were doing things I thought were cool. And kind of like picking their brain around it and like what they did, right? And so I don't know if people know so much like the statistics, but I think I put it here. I saw this when I was in college. One of the professors that I took when I was an undergrad like created this like the Latino educational pipeline, like essentially like big contribution in like education. Her name is Tara Yoso. And essentially, of 100 Latino students, less than one out of 100 have a PhD. So that's less than one person, right? There's like very few people who have PhDs in general, and the population is like a very small percentage of the US population, and even less of those are Latinos. I always joke with my students when we went to that conference, I was like, oh yeah, we all know each other. Or because there are literally so few of us, we literally all know each other because that was one of the questions that I think was like on one of the things that were submitted in terms of like representation of people, right? So I even like went to go look this up in terms of like faculty at Cal State Long Beach, right? In 2021, there was 900 total tenure track faculty on this campus. Of that, 97, or 10% are Hispanic/Latino, which is, I would say, kind of a lot, even though it's not a lot, right? 10%, considering the population of the demographics on this campus, which I looked up also, which is, I think Hispanic Latinos are almost half of the population on campus, which I think is less than I actually thought it would be, because I never went to a college ever that had this many students of color. And so like being in the classroom, it's kind of like overwhelming in a good way that the classes are dominated by people of color on this campus, which may or may not be something that folks here maybe take for granted. And I feel like I always tell my students that. I was like, you all take for granted that it's like so diverse here with your professors and your students, right? That's not to say that folks don't have to like experience like inequality because of that, right? And I think that's all that I wanted to, that's all that I had in terms of my presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to questions. So we have enough time.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that students submitted, but if you all have any questions you'd like to ask, well, if anything sparks your interest, go ahead and ask them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourselves. But our first question that was submitted is, what is one piece of advice you'd give to BIWOC who are thinking of pursuing graduate studies?
Yeah, I would say know what you're getting yourself into. I saw a lot well, in grad school, there's a really high attrition rate, meaning like people leave, and people leave for a lot of different reasons. Unfortunately, a lot of students of color end up leaving, right? And that could be for a lot of reasons. And what I saw a lot was people would maybe go and not know exactly what they were getting into by nature of like being first generation, right? Or maybe being like pressured to go to graduate school, or thinking that graduate school meant, I don't know, whatever they thought it meant, right? And so I would say know what you're getting yourself into and know what you're signing up for, because I think that going to graduate school is not about like making more money. Like that is not it. And sometimes people think like, oh, you become a professor, you get a PhD and you like, I don't know, make a lot of money or something like that. To be honest, going to graduate school is about me like being able to research and read and teach all day about like whatever I think is interesting, right? Like I get to talk to students, and I get to like put together classes that is like literally whatever I want it to be. That's in my eyes, that's like pretty great, right? Or that I get to like, I don't know, come up with things that I want to do, right? In terms of like my research as a graduate student and now as a professor. And yeah, so maybe like talk to people who have gone through what you want to go through, because graduate school is also a really big time commitment, right? Some people are like, I don't want to go to grad school because like I want to make money like right now or something, right? But it's also like a time investment, right? In terms of like, you know, I have maybe more job security as a professor or more flexibility in my time, right? Yeah, so that would be my advice.
Well, thank you for that answer. That's very helpful. I think like I agree, there's a lot of students that might not know a lot about graduate school, and maybe that comes with being first gen. But yeah, thank you for that piece of advice. Our second question is, what are some ways to deal with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, that's kind of a interesting question, because I think imposter syndrome could have a lot of different aspects to it, right? I feel like sometimes people equate imposter syndrome with, or I've equated imposter syndrome with like, I can't finish. And I don't think I ever thought, maybe this is like a privileged thing for me to say, but I never thought I couldn't finish my graduate program. Or I think I was more upset that there just like wasn't people of color in grad programs generally, right? Because grad programs are mostly white, they're mostly men. And yeah, I think it was just more like, oh, I'm here, but like, why are more people like me not here so much? And it was a little bit about, I think I also was really strategic and like, oh, I didn't want people to think I'm some like Latina sociologist. I was very adamant about being like, I want people to be like, she's a sociologist who happens to be Latina or something like that, right? Or happens to study Latino people. And so I think my imposter syndrome maybe has manifested itself more in terms of like now with my job, where I'm like, mostly it's like, oh, I can't believe it. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, I can't believe I'm like a professor. Like that's kind of crazy or something, right? I say this thing all the time and my friends are like, no, you're not. Where I'm always like for this, for example, I'm like, why am I speaking at this thing? I was like, I'm just some chick. And people are like, you're not just some chick. Like, what are you talking about? I was like, why do these students like want my input on stuff or something like that, right? Because I think it's like kind of a downplaying of a thing of like, I think I assume like, oh, everybody gets a PhD. It was like, no, they don't. But I think that's also because I don't want it to be like a thing. Like, I think I'm very like, I try to be very strategic with like not wanting having a PhD or being a professor to define like who I am as a person, if that makes sense. Because I'm like, I'm way more interesting than just like being a professor, I guess.
I really like that answer. I guess I've never really thought about it that way. But thank you for your advice. I know like imposter syndrome is something I deal with, especially now, like applying to grad school. So I really appreciate that. Our next question was kind of, somebody wanted to hear a little bit more about your transition from being an undergraduate student to a graduate student. I know you said you had a lot of different education trajectories, so just hearing a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think doing a master's program, although I would suggest if you have the resources to be able to do so and the knowledge and the experience to go right to a PhD, I think if I would have somehow been accepted to a PhD out of undergrad, I would have been super lost, or maybe I would have struggled more. And I think it really helped me that I went to this cultural studies master's before to sort of have some time to like figure out what was going on. Because I remember from going from my undergrad to going to my master's program was with PhD students. I was accepted like conditionally. They were like, you can do the master's and then you can reapply for the PhD to stay, but you're going to take the same classes with the PhD students essentially. And I ended up leaving because I was like, well, there's way better funding at UC Irvine because I got a full ride for 6 years to go to UCI. So like, I didn't have to take out any loans, and like, I got a living stipend for like working for them and stuff, and like health insurance and all this stuff. Right. But I was like struggling because it was like, you have to read like 3 full textbooks a week for your classes, like 3 books a week for your classes. And I don't remember how much I was reading in undergrad, but it definitely wasn't that much. And I'd be like, how am I going to read this? Like, what are these people talking about? Like, these people are these like armchair theorists who like sit around and just like read all day and somehow know what they're talking about. But then I realized that people were also faking it. And so, yeah, that was like helpful in like being in the struggle together. So that's why I think I talk about the importance of cohorts a lot, because like when I started grad school, a lot of time spent outside of class was with our cohort and like talking about the coursework or the material, or just like working together, which is something that I still do now. So like in grad school, I developed this thing of like working together with people, like at the library or at like a coffee shop or something. And I still do that now with like my grad school friends or like professor friends. Like every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I sit on Zoom with my friend who's a professor at a university in Michigan, and we just work together, and we set an hour block, and we're like, I'm going to work on this. And she's like, I'm going to work on that. And we're like, okay. And then we just do it. And at the end, we're like, how did it go? So it's like this kind of like staying in community with people to survive the things we all don't know together or like are going through.
I really like that answer. I think that's a great piece of advice, like working together with other people. Our next question is actually a little bit more personal, I guess. It's more towards how do you create a work-life balance, being a professor, doing all these things you mentioned you had on your plate, and also trying to like have like a social life. Yeah, we'd just like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think when I was in graduate school, I tried really hard to create a work-life balance that then translates now into my life as a professor. Because if you let, I guess anything, if you let school as an undergrad or as a PhD student or work as a professor, like take over your life, it can, right? Like the thing with being a professor now is that like, I can literally work at all hours. There will always be something to work on, right? Like I could work from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. no problem. Like I will find something I need to do because I have a list of things I need to do. And the same went with like when I was in grad school, right? Like I was doing a PhD and I was also teaching on the side to like make extra money. And I was also like a research assistant. So it's like, if you think there's a lot going on as an undergrad, it'll only continue to intensify as you continue to go along. When I was a grad student, I made like a choice, which may seem kind of harsh maybe to folks, where I chose to not really hang out with people I went to grad school with, because I was lucky enough that I went to a program where I still got to stay around my like friends and family from home, right? Being in UCI in Orange County. I mean, I was like, if I hang out with these people I'm in classes with and I'm doing a PhD with, that's kind of only the real thing we have in common. So if we hang out at like a bar or like getting coffee or having lunch, that's probably what we're going to talk about. And like, I don't want to spend my weekend or afternoon talking about essentially work or school, right? So I was really strategic with like continuing to just see my friends and family, but also being really careful with like not doing that too much, right? Which even now as like a faculty member, I was thinking about this like right before today. I was like, I do a lot of stuff to like, this sounds maybe kind of intense, to like maintain my sanity in terms of like my work-life balance, right? Like I go to yoga like 3 times a week, like I go to therapy, like I go to women's groups, like I like go to the chiropractor, like it's like every single day I have to do something that's going to keep me in check in some way, like mentally, in order to like show up and do my job, basically. Yeah, and also a big thing that I would always say is that also it's not that serious, and maybe that's like a privileged thing to say, but I was like I said, I can work forever, I can work as much as I want, but like it's not worth my sanity or my health to like overwork myself, right? That's not to say I'm not like working hard, but like, when I don't think I ever pulled an all-nighter in grad school. I was like, it's not worth it. Like, why would I do that to myself? And like when I was in grad school, I saw a lot of people go through a lot of like really serious health issues because of the stress of it. And I also went through like pretty serious health issues while I was in grad school. And I remember like contemplating like taking care of myself because I was like, but I gotta finish, or like I gotta whatever. And it was just like, it's not that serious. It's like, it is and it's not like just a job, right? And I think maybe that's my like activisty side of myself too, right? That like I was like, this institution doesn't care about me enough if I'm like killing myself over it, basically.
I think that's a great answer. I 100% agree. Like, it's never that serious. I mean, I know sometimes we can get caught up in like doing all these things and like having all these titles, but I think like it's really nice to hear somebody in like higher ed say like, you come first, your health comes first. So, I mean, I appreciate you keeping it real with us. Our next question is, what are some ways non-BIWOC people can support BIWOC students and staff?
That's an interesting question. I feel like being an ally, whatever that means in terms of like what that person wants to support with, right? Yeah, I feel like like BIWOC folks, I know it's hard for me to like speak for other people, I guess. But I know that like I have non-BIWOC friends from grad school, right? Considering that a lot of people in grad school are like white women and men, who served as allies, like not even maybe on purpose, or just like kind of was a part of who they were. So I guess it's kind of hard to speak for that, right? Like in terms of like the research that they did for like marginalized communities, not like for them, but like with them, right? Or maybe like involved in things that maybe didn't apply to them as an ally, right? Whether it was like some sort of like initiative on campus or something like that. So yeah, I guess my answer is like be an ally in something that you care about, like whether it's like first gen issues or if it's people of color issues, right? But that's like up to that person to decide like what they want to be an ally with or for.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. Our next question is, do you feel as a Latina woman there is enough representation of professors on campus?
No. I mean, but that's just a numbers issue, right? How can we hire more faculty of color if they don't exist, right? Like you can't hire more people to be professors if they're not getting PhDs, right? And I think that's sort of where we get those numbers from, and the inequality of faculty of color, right? Because people of color with the PhDs have only increased in recent years. And I think now we're seeing that shift of people of color being professors on campuses. And I think it's also campus specific, right? So I think the faculty on campus at Cal State Long Beach is somewhat diverse, given the diversity of the student population as well.
Thank you for your answer. Our last question that we have written here is, how do you deal with your white counterparts and their questions unrelated to work and related to your identity?
I feel like I haven't really had that experience, maybe, in terms of like in grad school or even as a professor. And maybe that's just because people by now know better, maybe, to be asking people questions related to their identity, right? I also think that they're not allowed to, or something like that, right? Yeah, and so let's see, the question is, how do you deal with your white counterparts and their questions unrelated to work? Yeah, I feel like people aren't really having questions unrelated to work. Or maybe that's just like a boundary that I'm setting with like being super work only with folks. Yeah, because I feel like people bring up non-work identities on their own, and maybe I don't do so as much. And so then people aren't asking me about it. So yeah, maybe in like grad school, but even then, I don't think I've had as problematic experiences as maybe I've heard other people have. But I also went to what I think is a pretty diverse grad program also, with also non-people of color who were also very like self-aware or like aware of inequality.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Muñiz? Anything that like sparked your interest, or maybe you want to know more about? If not, I can pass it over to Leanna.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anayeli, for doing the Q&A with Dr. Muñiz. The topics are awesome. I just really enjoyed, hearing your story. And I want to thank everyone, of course, for attending and taking the time, to join us and just hear the experience of Dr. Muñiz again. I do want to just leave, a few QR codes. The ones on the left is, to share your feedback with us. And also you could recommend some topics for the future. We do have the Rising Speaker next semester as well. And I think this information will help the council, determine what event they want to put on next. And then we also have an Instagram now. We did kind of branch out from the Women's and Gender Equity Center account. And that's just because we do hold like several events. So yeah, follow us to stay connected. And lastly, we do have the mini pumpkin painting party next week on the 20th. So if you are interested in that, please RSVP. And SSA, I also want to thank you, Isabel, for collaborating with us. As Dr. Muñiz did mention, she is the faculty advisor for the Sociology Student Association. So if anyone is interested in joining, connect with them. I will send a follow-up email with some resources. I saved the links that Dr. Muñiz did send earlier and the file she sent. So just in case if you didn't grab that, I will send a follow-up email to everyone that attended. But yeah, it was so awesome. Thank you, Dr. Muñiz. I'm a grad student too, so everything that you said, I definitely did take in. And I also want to take the time to empower you. You are not just a professor, you're not just some chick teaching a sociology course. I think it's important for us to share the knowledge, just like you said, and yeah, I'm glad that more people were able to hear it from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks everyone for coming.
I'll drop the link in the chat. So in case people. All right, the link is in the chat for the assessment fee survey.
I just wanted to say thank you again, Dr. Muñiz, for agreeing to do our Rising Speaker series, and just for like all your mentorship. And I just really appreciate like the insight today. So yeah, we just want to say thank you, and we appreciate your time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, and thanks for asking me to be a speaker.